Talking to Death is released every Friday and brought to you absolutely free. But if you want ad-free listening and exclusive bonuses, subscribe to Tenderfoot Plus at tenderfootplus.com or on Apple Podcasts.
Talking to Death is a production of TenderfootTV and iHeart Podcasts. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome back to Talking to Death. This week, Payne sits down with Madison McGhee. Madison is the creator and host of the Ice Cold Case podcast, where she investigates the cold case murder of her own father. In this episode, Madison breaks down her own investigative work into her father's cold case. They discuss her struggles in making a podcast about such a sensitive topic and the toll that process takes, and Payne imparts some of his own investigative wisdom. This week, Madison McGhee.
Good to see you. It's been a minute.
I know,
yeah. It was CrimeCon, right? That we saw each other, which was such a, crazy...
we barely talked. Yeah.
I think I saw you for 30 seconds, and I think I saw everyone for 30 seconds. I don't think I had 30 seconds of my own, thinking that was not disrupted by something else. Good time, but it was a whirlwind.
I don't want to be Payne Lindsey at CrimeCon, ever.
Why
You're
that?
It's too crazy.
It can be a little much. It's like the one time in, the world where I go downstairs to a Starbucks and there's a good chance that almost everyone knows who I am. Usually that doesn't happen anywhere. But in that particular environment, it's likely. And you have to kind of be aware of that.
Totally.
But yeah, that was fun. You had a cool panel.
Yeah.
How was that for you? I mean, because you have your own very unique kind of entry point into the true crime podcast space. Not many people start making a true crime podcast because of something that they're really actually related to. And so I think you fall into a very unique category. And so for those who don't know your backstory and how you got into this true crime podcasting thing too, what started it all in terms of, I want to make a podcast?
Well, my dad was murdered when I was 6, and I didn't know until I was 16. And even then, when I found out, I wasn't like, podcast. It was like, oh my God, my whole life is ruined. And then as I, spent, I don't know, maybe 6 or 7 years processing that, it sort of evolved into, I want to solve it, and I am kind of creative and I need an outlet to do that. And podcasting was the lowest lift. And so now I'm here doing this.
So you said you found out your dad was murdered when you were 6, but you didn't really know that he was murdered until you were 16? What do you mean?
Yeah, I knew my dad died, but I was told that he had a heart attack.
Okay.
So that's just sort of how I had processed. It's not easy, of course, losing a parent ever, especially at a young age. But, I was able to sort of process it through this scientific lens of this happens to people. And then to find out at 16 that it was more at the hands of someone else, it felt a little before your time sort of situation. That made it a little bit harder to process again. And then also I was lied to. So that there was a lot of layers involved in that discovery.
Yeah, so anyone losing a parent is awful and something that, I've never thankfully had to deal with yet. And I can imagine you being 6 years old trying to rationalize how your father may have died of some sort of natural causes.
Yeah.
And that kind of got flipped on its nose a little bit, or tell me how that went down.
Yeah. So I realized that I had a really strong instinct. When I was 16, I was visiting my dad's side of the family for the first time since his funeral. And my mom and I were there, and we saw my cousin Omar, and he was saying goodbye to us as we were leaving. And I had like a physical reaction to seeing him. It felt like someone had punched me in the stomach. So I hurled forward. I mean, the breath was knocked out of my lungs. I couldn't breathe. My mom was like, "What's wrong?" She thought I was having like a panic attack. And I almost like saw a movie in my head, and I watched my dad laying on the floor and my cousin Omar standing next to him. And of course, at the time, I thought my dad had a heart attack. So I get in the car and I'm telling my mom what I saw. And I'm like, I think Omar was there and like watched my dad die and didn't help him while he was like having a heart attack. And my mom freaked out, and we go to a Buffalo Wild Wings, and I haven't eaten meat since. And my mom tells me that my dad was murdered and that Omar was probably there and had some sort of weird connection to the story in that morning. And it was weird that I knew that. And she thought someone had told me something, but no one had said anything to me. So yeah, that's how I found out.
So, I mean, assuming you didn't have a lot of prior knowledge to the inner workings and the details of what may have happened to your dad in terms of the murder, when you had this exchange with Omar, that seemed like it was pretty brief, right? It was when you were parting ways, or did you give him a hug, or what was the circumstances?
No physical touch. Yeah, we were leaving.
But you looked at him.
Yeah, I just saw him.
And so, like, when you, in that moment when you see him, like, take me back. Like, what did you experience?
I mean, it was like I truly felt like someone punched me in the stomach. Like, it felt like a fist hit my stomach. Like, the moment I was walking away, we were at my grandmother's house, and he lived there, but he lived upstairs. And so while we were there visiting, he was not downstairs at all. And as we were like getting ready to go, at some point he came downstairs. And then as we were like outside walking down the steps to go to the car, he's on the front porch, and he must have said like bye or something, because my mom and I both turned around. And the moment I turned around, it was like someone punched me in the stomach.
Did it feel like a instinctual threat to you? Or was it some sort of energy thing, or you didn't really know what to make of it?
Yeah, I mean, I had no idea what was going on. I didn't feel threatened in the moment. Like, I wasn't scared. I mean, I was afraid that like something weird was happening to me, but I wasn't like, oh my gosh, someone is like, yeah, I was just like, this is so strange. And then it was like, I mean, it was so quick, but it's like, I felt like I watched a 45-minute movie. You know, it's so
like
weird.
A blip, right?
Yeah.
So what do you make of that? Just that experience in and of itself. What do you think that was? Like some sort of like, precognition, or like some sort of, like, what were you picking up on? What's the logical way to explain that, or the other way of
there's
explaining
none.
that,
There's no logical
Well, give me
way.
your take. You experienced it. I wasn't there. So like, you've had years to probably like look back on it in hindsight. What was it to you? Why'd you feel that way?
I mean, I'm a superhero. I don't know.
You're a superhero.
Like, I don't know.
Is that your superpower? Is
I sure
getting gut punched?
yeah, totally.
Metaphorically, yeah.
I don't know. I it's hard to explain because I don't know where I stand in the like spiritual sense, right? I grew up super religious. Sure. So at the time you're like, oh, God is telling me something, but now I'm like, what was that? I don't know. So I don't know, but I can pinpoint other moments in my life that aren't as severe, where I've been like, oh, something weird is about to happen, and then it does. And so I don't know if that's just like we all have that and I'm more aware of it, or I don't know. It could have been my dad. I mean, who knows, right? Like, it just depends on like what you believe and all of that kind of stuff. And I have no idea.
It was something instinctual that you didn't consciously set in motion that you reacted to. And, I believe in, instincts. I think that there's probably a million ways to explain them. Sometimes there's circumstances that, defy, logic. but yeah, it seems like you were definitely picking up on something that subconsciously that was important and heavy. And in hindsight, I guess you still remember it that way. And so after this experience, what kind of unfolds over the next couple of years as you're a young adult growing into, an older teenager, 18, and you're kind of like, I guess, piecing together parts of your past that you thought were one way, but now they're another. Like, take me through that process after this Omar incident and as you're growing older and maturing and probably like looking at it from a million different angles.
Yeah. So it's kind of an interesting time. It was on my dad's birthday in 2012, which is the year I graduated high school. So I am like 3 weeks away from going to college. Yeah. And so my whole life is like shifting and evolving, like from a personal perspective. And now this is like this big bomb that's like dropped into my life. And now everything feels like it's so chaotic. I had plans at the time to major in biochemistry with a minor in neuroscience and be a doctor.
Oh, wow.
That is not what happened.
Sounds hard.
I went to college and I changed my major like almost immediately. And it was I was always really interested in filmmaking, and I thought, because I grew up in West Virginia, that would never make me any money. So that would always just be something I would do for fun on the side. Yeah. And I sort of saw that as like a path to closure for my dad and myself, but also a job. And so I sort of pivoted into that world and really was just desperate to learn how to make movies and documentaries so that one day, eventually, I'd be able to tell my dad's story.
So at some point, you were inspired enough to take the trauma that you had experienced and, your upbringing and all the unanswered questions that you had, endured, and put that into a podcast. So
yes.
What gave you the nerve to do that, and what were you hoping to get out of that?
That's a great question. What gave me the nerve to do that? I think it was this weird combination of free time, which I didn't really have a lot of until I started, and this delusion that like maybe it would do something. And I think that kind of ties in with like the why, right? I thought when I first started looking into my dad's case, you couldn't find anything. Like there wasn't an article that would come up from a local newspaper about John Cornelius McGhee's murder. And so I had to like drive to Ohio. I was living in Portland, Oregon at the time. I had to drive 41 hours to Ohio and like fish in a library from like beginning of July for like years and years and years of 2002, just trying to find these articles. And so at that point, it was like, if I can just make this case a little more popular, then maybe it will get solved. Because right now, the Belmont County Sheriff's Department at the time was getting away with doing nothing because nobody was checking in on that. So that was sort of the goal. And it was a lofty goal considering like I was doing it by myself, but that was the idea. And I guess the sort of push was that I finally had some time to do it.
Yeah, so you had time to sort of craft this plan and I guess in a way take a risk. And you knew that, if you just did nothing, then nothing was probably ever going to happen because nothing's ever happened at all. So
right.
Maybe at the very least, you poking here and there or just even finding an article, that otherwise would never be found. Maybe that starts to create some sort of momentum that otherwise wouldn't exist.
Like, there was something at the time I wasn't super vocal about, like, oh, my dad was murdered. But I couldn't imagine having a conversation with someone like later in life and saying like, oh yeah, my dad was murdered in 2002 and it's an unsolved case. And them look at me and just out of curiosity be like, oh, did you do anything about that? And me just be like, well, no, I just, whatever.
Right. What'd you find out? And you're like, oh, I never really looked into it. Yeah.
Yeah, like that's just not my personality. And so, yeah, that I feel like it was just a natural progression to do this.
Yeah. It's kind of a strange burden in a way. Not even burden, just more like, for yourself. It's like, yeah, you're looking down the barrel of the rest of your life and this comes up and you're like, yeah, I never really did anything about that.
Yeah, no,
right.
Totally. I mean, it was like, no matter what, this would be my story and I would have to do this.
Yeah.
And like that's super shitty, but it is what it is.
Yeah, right. It's very shitty, but what is it shittier to regret not having given something a shot?
Yeah.
Is that how you look at it, or?
It's how I looked at it at the time. I go back and forth every day about if I should have ever done this or not.
Really? What happened?
You know how like there's those photos of like the like Obama like when he entered office and then when he left and he looks like 500 years older.
Yeah, he's
like
300 years older.
That's me.
Yeah.
Like that I've only been doing this for a year and a half and like that is me. And actually Meredith, our mutual friend, asked me a while ago. She was like, "Well, if you could do anything differently, like what would you do?" And I was like, "Oh, I just wouldn't have done it. Like I would have never done this if I could do it over."
Would have never done this shit at all.
Yeah.
What's been the hardest part of doing this that makes you have that kind of knee-jerk reaction of like, oh yeah, if I were to change anything, like maybe I wouldn't have been involved in this because of why?
I mean, gosh, all of it, right? I think that obviously when you have sort of the hope that this will do something, I mean, I remember the feeling when I first hit publish on the first episode. And
what was that feeling?
That feeling of like, just like I have finally done something that like might move the needle a little bit. And the unknown, I think, is almost more exciting than like when you know, obviously, what happens. And so looking back, I see sort of the cost of all of this in my personal life, my professional life, my financial life, my mental health. I mean, my entire sense of self.
What do you mean? Like, how do you feel differently?
I mean, I don't know who I am without this, and I don't like that feeling.
You feel very tied to it?
Yeah, and I feel like even to like other people, it's very hard now. In a way, I mean, I struggle with anxiety and depression pre this, but I think it's almost gotten like, I thought I was like the worst ever. And I'm like, oh, I'm way worse now. The paranoia almost of everyone I meet and interact with, it's like, oh, do they only want to be my friend because I have this like true crime podcast and they're so obsessed with true crime and they love true crime and like they don't actually like me or want to be my friend? Or if I stopped doing this, would I stop hearing from everyone in my life like what is real and what is not? And you know, I've really sort of like hunkered down and I've like, I don't really hang out with anyone anymore. Like I don't do anything. I like sit at home with my cat. Like my life looks a lot different than it did when this started.
Is that a good thing or a bad thing or just a new thing that you're navigating or you don't know?
Yeah, I don't know. I guess I'm just navigating and sort of taking everything as it comes. But like I think about, you know, where all the time I've spent on this podcast and this investigation, like
which is a lot.
I could have made 5 movies. Like I could have done so much with my
Built
time.
100 buildings and
and
world hunger.
Yeah,
or whatever,
done anything. Right? And so if this never gets solved, it's like, oh my God, what did I spend the last X amount of time doing? And like last night I was up all night working on this. And it's like, for what?
Well, you asked yourself that, and did you have an internal response?
No. I have no idea. I'll let you know when I figure it out.
But then you kept doing it though, right? You said for what, but then you went back, head down, and did it again?
Yeah, I guess, yeah. Thank you, PhD Payne.
Well, I mean, like maybe that it's a rational question, especially when you feel like you're spinning your wheels and you're like, this isn't going anywhere, or, this is like time gets wasted. And that, I personally hate wasting time, wasting other people's time. Like, like it just feels like so unproductive and just not like I'm moving forward in life. And, going through a cold case, I feel like that's like 90% of it is all of this, I wouldn't even call it wasted energy, but it most certainly feels like it, because you could go down this whole thing for days, weeks, months, and really not yield anything. And maybe all you did yield was that's not what you should be doing. And it took you 6 months to figure that out, and that's annoying. You wish you just knew that right away, and you could spend that 6 months having done something else or putting that energy elsewhere. As someone who, builds this show, and you're making a show about your investigation into your father's unsolved murder, what's your take on the true crime genre and the audience who is so obsessed with it?
It's been a wild ride. I grew up, which is so weird to look back now because my mom knew my dad was murdered the whole time. My mom had me watching America's Most Wanted when I was like 6. So I've been watching that show like every Saturday night for most of my life. And I would have considered myself sort of a consumer of true crime. So then to sort of fall into like subject of it definitely shifted my perspective of like the craft of it and the art of it. It's very different than like making a movie, which can be about anything, and the characters are made up, and if you change their story or they get heartbroken, they're fake. It doesn't matter. And this is so much more real. So it definitely feels different. I remember, and I will never do this again, but I remember in like high school being like, oh yeah, I love that documentary about whatever getting killed, right? And you're like, whoa, that's weird to say now, because like that's my dad and that's someone else's cousin and that's someone else's sister, and like it just has really humanized the whole thing for me. But then also as like, I don't know, I mean, it's such a bigger conversation, but the types of stories that are told, right? My dad, the only reason that like you couldn't find anything about my dad is because no one gives a shit about a black drug dealer from Ohio who was a informant and got shot in his house. It's like, obviously. I mean, even the reviews.
Care, and that they pushed that into a dusty box to never be found again. He got
what was coming to him, and like that's because the genre has set that tone. Right? So it's tough. But I think the interest level, I really believe that, because I have these conversations every day now, if my dad's story hasn't turned into a derivative yet because of a long list of reasons, including it's not popular enough, and there's all of these reasons why, right?
What do you mean derivative? Like what derivative do you want it to be?
Like a documentary or whatever. I mean, I don't necessarily want it to go that route, but like, there's 800 John Benet Ramsey docs, right? There's 40 about all of these different cases, right? And there's reasons why we don't see stories like my dad's, not necessarily my dad's, but stories like my dad's, because they're not getting purchased. I believe if they were, and they were put on streaming platforms, people would watch them. There are network execs saying that no one wants that, and that's why they're not buying them. But they set the tone of what people want, because people want what they're given, especially in the entertainment industry. And so I think that that's where I think that the genre sort of sets that tone, Because if more of those stories were being told, people would consume them. They're just less told.
So when you set out to make this podcast, you had to do a super deep dive into the details of, what may have happened the night of, suspects, persons of interest, family. I would imagine very difficult, intricate things that you're dealing with. As you're going through there, like, what did you kind of initially discover as the potential circumstances of when and how your dad was actually murdered?
So it's such a weird story. Almost immediately you realize that the story on paper on the police files is not probably the most accurate version of the story, just because it doesn't make a lot of sense. So my dad lived next door to his sister, and his sister's son, who was like an adult child, like 18, 19, 20, is there. And there's 3 people in the house, and their house gets broken into. And that's the beginning of this morning of, eventually my dad getting killed. And 4-ish, they don't even know how many people break into the house and are there for like 40 minutes, like ransacking the house, looking for money.
There to rob the house?
Yeah.
The burglary attempt?
They're there for money, and they don't find any after 40 minutes. And they end up next door at my dad's house with Omar. And then they shoot my dad as he's like approaching the door because he hears someone outside. And they kick in the door. My dad is standing there. They shoot him, 1 shot. He falls to the ground. They don't even enter the house, and they leave. So it's weird because the police are sort of adamant that this is a home invasion gone wrong. They didn't mean to shoot anyone. They were just there to rob people, but they didn't take anything, and they were there for a really long time. So it doesn't really make sense. And so that's sort of where I pick up this, and that's what I'm left with. And then it's like, here you go, like, figure it out.
And so Omar was there, correct?
Yeah.
Was he shot?
No.
Why do you think that is?
It's a good question. I think that he wasn't the target, so he wasn't shot.
Or he was with the other guys, and I could see a scenario where they barge into the house next door, and maybe they get spooked by an immediate person there, and they just pull the trigger. But that would also mean that Omar was there and saw that happen.
Yeah.
Right?
I mean, there's 3 people in the other house where they've spent a lot of time and they've seen their faces, which is obviously like in all of these stories, like if you see someone's face, it's almost like you're gonna die. And none of them are hurt at all. So it's just so strange. My dad didn't have a gun in his hand. I mean, there's just a lot of weird things that would make you wonder, like, why shoot? And also, if the people who I believe were there were really there, they knew my dad. So even if they're spooked that my dad's at the door, he's unarmed, he's going to immediately see someone he knows. Even if he has beef with them, he's probably just going to be like, get out of here. His daughter's in the bedroom. Like, he's not going to do anything. So it's very strange that if you do know this person, you're still going to shoot them and it be an accident. I don't know. It just seems strange.
Yeah, it's strange.
I also do believe there were like 4-ish people there, and only one of them could have done it. And so I'm very curious, out of these 4 people, who did it.
Forensically here, like, there was 1 shot.
Yeah.
So yeah, if there's 4 people, only 1 person shot. If they all shot, there'd be 4 shots. So,
right.
But that also means that there is potentially 3 witnesses to somebody shooting.
Yeah.
And I guess if you were there and covered this up, I guess you were also in some way a part of this crime.
Yeah.
Do you know how tight these individuals were then? and how tight they may be now, and all these years later?
Yeah, they were pretty close at the time. Colleagues, if you will, but also like lifelong friends. I mean, this is a small town, so they have known each other for a really long time. At this point, there are a couple of them that I believe are still connected to each other through LLC filings I've found, but I don't know.
Business ventures that have not or been started or something, or what do you mean?
Yeah. Their names are on it, or their names are on bank accounts together for these businesses or things like that. Now, that doesn't necessarily speak to if they're like buddies still and like hang out, but
like presumably you only do that with people you kind of trust and still communicate with.
Yeah. And I think that the lifelong trust, especially in these towns with what they're presumably doing, is really important. So I do think that some of them are still connected. 3 of them are currently in prison. So there's that. And 1 is not.
Having, meticulously gone through a lot of police reports and interviews and all the evidence that you could get your hands on in this case, kind of shaping the narrative of your father's murder, are there any things that you believe that the police really mishandled in this case that changed the course of it forever, to the point where, all these years later that his daughter's having to make a podcast to try to figure out what happened?
Yes. They, from the beginning, for whatever reason, displayed incredible negligence. I say that because benefit of the doubt, which I don't know if they deserve. It's a small town. There's not a lot of funding, not great staffing. The first person on the scene was a traffic cop who was on his way to work and got the call, so he showed up. He's not going to know. He's there to give parking tickets and speeding tickets.
CSI,
Yeah. So, but at the same time, I, as we've discussed, am not that smart. And I would know to tape off a scene or swipe for fingerprints or look for gunpowder residue on hands. Like, there's certain things that, like, you just know from watching any television show. And they never taped off the scene. My family was walking in and out of the house within minutes of this happening. I don't know that they have any evidence at all. And so, there's lots of places within this investigation where it could have been solved, or there could have been hope of it getting solved. And now it's really up to 3 of those 4 guys saying, hey, I don't want to go to prison for the rest of my life. I'll tell you who did it.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that will ever happen.
Because really, like, based on the way that you're saying that they handled the scene and how that unfolded, there wasn't any major collection of evidentiary items that are in some locker somewhere that could be the smoking gun all these years later. It's kind of like a whole bunch of nothing, and the crime scene was tainted, and now it's just about he said, she said, and you got a group of people, but like the physical evidence is almost like not enough to really, I guess, point anywhere, unless there is something that unless there is something there in terms of, like, I guess, the type of gun or those things.
It's so
known.
Weird. Yeah, it was a handgun. And they couldn't find it. When my sister got home from giving her statement at the police station, my dad had a lot of guns in the house. He was a drug dealer, so he had several. And I also think that's what's so strange is on his way to the front door, he never grabbed one, which just leads me to believe he knew the people obviously on his front porch, because if he didn't, he would have grabbed a gun. Right. But when my sister got home, all of the guns had been removed from the house. and she never
As in
saw them again.
Stolen, removed.
I mean,
Well,
define
like, where are
stolen. They were taken by family members because the police told them to get them all out of the house.
So they still
loaded
exist?
them up on a. I mean, they're like they've been sold, given away.
Okay.
Yeah, so they were loaded up onto a truck bed and driven out, and who knows where they ended up.
Who did that?
So, my uncle, because one of the detectives who was my dad's sort of like person he reported to as an informant, when he arrived, told my uncle Curtis to get all of the guns out of the house. So he did.
Why would he do that?
It's a great question. There's a lot of speculation in the town that my dad was killed with one of his own guns. I don't know logistically how that would be possible. These people never entered the house. But it is an interesting theory given sort of that information. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, my 16-year-old sister shows up, sees a bunch of guns on a truck bed covered by a blanket being driven away, walks inside of a house where all of her family members are going in and out after her dad has been murdered in the living room. And every gun that was in her house is gone.
Mm-hmm. So there is no, like, the gun that killed your dad, no one knows where that is?
No. And my sister and her mom, we have different moms, 2 weeks after this happened, found a bullet casing in the living room of my dad's house. So, like, that wasn't even, like, put in a bag. I mean, it's just, like, so obvious that not enough was done. Is it the
only one? Is that the only bullet casing that was found?
That's the only one she saw, yeah.
Interesting. And so do you believe that to be the actual bullet that was used in the gun?
I don't know. Because, again, I don't know what the police, if they found one, if they put it in a bag, if it's somewhere in a filing cabinet somewhere. But it's possible. But it's also possible that it's not. It's hard to say. I also don't know, like, if that bullet casing came from a handgun or something else. Like, my sister wouldn't know that either.
Have you asked the police these questions? Like, are they cooperative in the way of, hey, do you guys have a bullet casing from the crime scene of my dad's murder? Like, have you been able to ask that kind of question? And if so, do they have a response to that?
Yeah. So, I have talked to them just a handful of times. Once was in person. I had gotten the case files. I read through them all. And then I drove again from Portland to Ohio to meet with them face to face. And sort of that was more of like, let's just go through these case files. I'm really curious, like, according to you, what really happened that day. And then I went back and I sent an email of like, here's some questions I have. I'd love to get back on the phone or a Zoom or just respond to this email with the answer to these questions. And there were like 10. One of them was, because they were very weird about it's an open case and you can't have everything and we've given you what we can, et cetera, et cetera. So one of my questions was, I don't need to see it, but can I have a list of evidence that you have? Just so I know what you have, what you don't have. And that was one of the questions on that list. And they've never responded to that request. So as I talk to them, which it's been a year since we've spoken, I always bring that up. And it's just, they just don't respond.
The bullet casing found by your family, where is that one?
Gone, for sure.
What do you mean gone? Where did it go?
Probably thrown away.
Why?
So, I mean, my sister was 16, very close to my dad, much closer than I was. Struggled very hard with this. I mean, she was in the house when it happened. She called 911. Wow. Her mom was not, I mean, my dad took care of my sister. So when her mom sort of stepped in to take on that role, it was very much like, and I think everyone in my family had this mentality of like, let's just move on from this. So as things were, being found, I mean, my sister now will reach out if she hears something or, oh, I heard this name. But I think at the time, I mean, I didn't see my sister for 20 years.
Wow.
I think it was like, let's just move on.
She wanted
with
to
our lives.
almost purge herself from this and the cleansing, like, this is a horrible experience. I don't even want to be around these things.
Yeah. Yeah.
I would imagine that, reopening this on your own accord and poking around and talking to, friends and family members who I would imagine some of them don't want to talk about this, right? For, good and bad reasons. And, has there been any strain on your relationship with your family since you started creating this podcast?
What family? Yeah.
But what do you mean by that? Do you feel like that? Did you feel like that before you started?
Yeah, it's a weird position I'm in because I didn't really know them before doing this.
Okay, so in a way did that help you maybe, like, to be able to just...
Yeah, it was definitely, I knew that the response was going to be like, where did this bitch come from? Like, what are you doing? Why are you here? Uprooting our lives like this. And in ways it made me a little numb, but I am such an empath that, like, it took a huge toll on me just knowing that, like, I mean, I get upset if, like, I cried the other day in the car because I accidentally cut someone off and they were, like, yelling at me. And, like, that's the type of person I am. So even if I'm like, I don't really care about them, the fact that they're mad at me, I'm like, oh my God, they're mad at me. And so I don't like that.
Yeah, you don't want to be the cause of more hurt.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel like they're, despite the reopening of wounds, which is never fun, it's always ugly, it's not a pretty thing, but it's something that has to be done if there's a serious attempt being made to try and figure out what happened, right? Do you feel like your family is on board with trying to figure out what happened, despite how difficult it may be to, I don't know, see and hear all this?
I don't know. I think there are family members that want this solved for sure. Mm-hmm. And I mean, my sister is such a good example, actually. She doesn't love the podcast. She's not loving, my method of doing this, but she's so supportive.
Why not?
She's pretty private and wasn't that enthused about all of
She's
this.
She's like, don't talk about me. I have a job and I got just basic, like, I didn't sign up for this. Right.
Yeah, but she's super supportive. And she's like, you have to do what you need to do for closure to figure out what happened. And she thinks that I'm close and wants me to find the answer. So I think that there's that as well. But she's super supportive. And I think that's the perfect example of, like, wouldn't be my method, but I get it and I'm here for you. And I have other family members that are sort of just like, leave me out of it. I don't really care about all this. I just want to move on with my life. And then I have family members that are like, if I ever get the chance, I'm going to put a bullet in your head.
Right.
So there's a lot. There's a spectrum to everything,
Yeah. And there's a lot of moving parts and, feelings and ties, and you're dealing with family and, you're not trying to cause any more hurt than was already caused. Right.
Right.
And I think what's unfortunate about investigating a cold case, like, at least from what I've learned personally, is that no matter what, somebody is going to be upset because it's upsetting. The whole thing is upsetting, right? Revisiting an upsetting event, or, these series of unknowns that you've kind of pushed out of your brain a little bit because they were driving you crazy, revisiting that is upsetting because something upsetting happened. And so it's kind of like, it's the shitty part about finding the truth that's like a further aftermath of what somebody did in the first place by murdering, by murdering your
Yeah.
father. Do you think that, throughout all the episodes you've done so far and the people you've talked to and learning along the way as you're growing as a storyteller and an amateur investigator yourself now, do you feel like you've been able to uncover anything new or important enough that gives hope to a potential resolution down the road?
Yes. It's such a weird set of circumstances because I entered this naively thinking that my dad's murder was a mystery. I think a lot of people know exactly what happened that day and exactly who was there and have just been so eager to move on with their lives that they just don't want to talk about it.
Yeah.
And so I think that I have figured it out, which is great because I don't give a fuck. I'm going to tell everyone who killed my dad, right? But these people have been able to get away with it for so long that, yeah, I do feel like I've uncovered something, but now I'm sort of unfortunately learning how not mysterious this really was and how half of this town probably has known the entire time what really happened.
It wasn't some big conspiracy. It's just like, hey, there was a couple dudes here one day and they kind of all know what happened and they just never said anything, which is almost kind of, would piss you off probably because it's, if it was that simple, then why hasn't it, come to a resolution, right?
Yeah, totally. And I think that there's lots of reasons for that. I think that, we're talking about career criminals, right? They know what they're doing. They all have each other's backs. And also, it's such a unique part of the country where the border of Ohio and West Virginia is really important. West Virginia doesn't have the death penalty. Ohio does. They killed my dad on the Ohio side. If they get charged for murder, it's not up to me or anyone else except the prosecutors and the DA what they get charged with. And so there's this level of I've talked to a lot of people who were around at the time, dealing drugs at the time, and they all would agree you'd rather get caught in West Virginia than Ohio for anything.
Well, if the murder happened in Ohio, I'm assuming that that's where it would be prosecuted, or is there
so they'd be screwed, potentially.
Right. So if you're aware of these individuals and you feel like, pretty strongly that they know something more than they're telling and they've kept secrets and it's not this big mystery that it has been made out to be for your whole life, what next steps do you take to try to infiltrate that and, I don't know, get somebody to say something or engage in a conversation?
I'm in a really interesting position currently because I've actually spoken to one of these individuals face to face.
How'd that go?
It was wild.
Was it a surprise knock or did you plan it out?
No, it was planned. They reached out to me. I thought they were in prison, was planning to sort of write them a letter and get added to their visitor list and visit them behind glass. And I woke up one morning to a message on Facebook and they had been released and they had heard the show and they reached out to me.
Why did they reach out to you? Did they tell you why they wanted to reach out?
Yeah, they wanted me to know the truth, which was their truth is that they weren't there and had nothing to do with it.
Okay, but what's the other truth?
That they pulled the trigger.
So you think that there's a potentially this person is just saying I did nothing, but maybe he's really saying that he did it.
Yeah, I think it's very possible that this person was there and did it, and now he's back in prison. And two of the other guys are also in prison, and there's one that is not. And he seems to have sort of turned his life around. He works for the public defender's office. And I think if anyone has the most to lose, it's someone like that. And maybe they would be willing to tell me what happened in exchange for something else. So that's my only hope at this point.
I mean, it is interesting to me that this individual on his own accord reached out to you to say that he wants you to know the truth, and his truth was just simply that I didn't do anything, right?
Yeah.
Because unless you, I guess, really definitively pointed the finger at specifically this person, it seems a little bit out of line. It seems a little extra.
I did.
And maybe, that, like, does that require or a follow-up? I mean,
no, I mean, it seems strange. And I mean, even our interaction, it was all so bizarre. I mean, just the calmness, it was like I was talking to a sociopath. Like, it was so weird. But yeah, I mean, he says he didn't do it. I mean, there was a point in time where I'm like, I mean, if this guy killed my dad, would he sit across a table from me? I mean, that just seems so crazy. But I don't know.
Maybe he would if he was really spooked about getting caught and is all of a sudden doing, completely bizarre, drastic measures to give the opposite impression. But
I have a theory. At the time, he was really adamant that he had just been released from prison. He received a 7-year sentence for a drug charge and was released because he appealed and won. And his appeal was that he was set up by the Belmont County Sheriff's Department. And so him winning sort of set this standard that, like, he gets set up for crime sometimes by Belmont County, right? So if they think he killed my dad, maybe that's a setup too. But when I talked to him, he was very much like, I want to help you. We can work together. And again, there's that selfish motive, of course, of if I find someone else who did it, then it wasn't you. But a few months later, he gets arrested again on a massive drug trafficking charge. So I feel like there was almost this hope that, like, if I could come in and be like, look at how corrupt Belmont County is, that serves him. And then he maybe knew this charge was coming down the line and it would have all worked out for him. And so I didn't know that, obviously, when I met up with him. But yeah, I mean, I'm just trying to play all these scenarios in my head to try to justify, why anyone would want to meet up with me and sit down with me. And none of the other guys have done this. I reached out to one to talk to them through a mutual friend and they said no. So I'll just show up at their house. But yeah.
Are you still in contact with the guy who is now back in prison?
Not since he went to prison. He would call me like once a week.
Are you able to write him or like make contact? Or, I mean, obviously it's more difficult now, but
yeah, I mean, I could. I haven't yet. It's still fairly new, but yeah, I could.
Like, is this dude facing like hard time now?
Yeah.
Or he'll be there for a while, I guess. Either way.
He'll be there for a little bit. I don't know. It's so weird because it's just the lifestyle, right? They go in to prison for like 5-6 years, and they come out, and then they go back, and then they come out.
Has that shaped your approach moving forward in the next installment?
So I have ideas for sort of what part 3 will look like. And it includes a much more like quote unquote official approach. So now I'm sort of at a point where I've done all the research, I've built the context, I've gotten familiar with the world. Now, if if all I can do is like mail a file to the Belmont County Sheriff's Department, like what's in it? What do I put in there? Do I say I found this and these people are connected and I have evidence of this LLC and this bank account and this happening and at this time this was this person's email, and just a list of like my own kind of case file almost. And so part 3 is going to be me sort of assembling that and hopefully putting it to bed on my end. Like, this is what I have and this is what I found, and like, do something with this or don't, but you're going to look like assholes if you don't, because now the whole world is watching you.
Is your plan to mail it literally?
I mean, I'll probably bring it myself.
I mean, I think the best way to do it is call a meeting that they eventually have to just say, okay, fine. And you just sit there and you unpack it and give it to them physically, and we get to hear what the fuck they say. Yeah.
I mean, I would want to, go in person. Cause there's little things like, I'd really love to test. Omar says that these guys poured rubbing alcohol on them when they broke into the house, and the detective said that he could smell the rubbing alcohol on them, but I think that's kind of strange. So I'm going to like dump rubbing alcohol on clothes and let them sit outside for 20 minutes and then go back and see if I can smell it. And like, I'm going to do like my own sort of like line by line investigation, which I haven't really done because I've been talking to people and trying to get information and doing all this stuff. So my approach is going to get a little more aggressive and be a little different. But it's almost like, this is it. Like, this is all I have left to do, and this is all I can do. And then it's really like not up to me. Like, they have to decide what to do with that. So
do you feel like the lack of control and the ultimate outcome in real life and as a creative person and your narrative is maddening?
It's horrific. It's really tough. I'm very type A, and I'm a Leo, so I definitely try to control everything. I mean, I'm a producer, so it's just like I produce my life. I project manage my laundry. Like, I just am always in that mindset. And so it is really, really hard to be working with a scenario and people that are really kind of doing whatever they will. And I have no control at all over it. I can just tell the story as it's happening. It's a nightmare.
Just in conclusion, since you've made a podcast and you've put yourself out there, you've had some really cool coverage on your show and your dad's story, your story. So like, what has your experience been with starting with the positive in terms of, I don't know, have people reached out and been touched by your story and shown their support in that way, and that been a positive thing?
Yeah. I've been met with so much support. It's been honestly a bit overwhelming, only because when I did this, I mean, it was me and a couple friends in my living room doing this and then like hitting upload. So for anyone at all to be listening is like always so wild. And it's been really great just to know that, it was a fine line, because while I wanted this story out there, it's so wildly personal. You kind of wonder, like, is this going to resonate with anyone? Like, will anybody even understand this enough to like want to listen? Because it is very like personal and specific.
It's my story, right? Like, do people care about my story? Like, there's a little bit of like, I get that.
So it was really nice to sort of see how, I open up about my mom struggling with addiction and what it was like growing up with an addict and, those types of things. And maybe someone who doesn't relate to their dad getting murdered, they understand other elements of the story. And I think that has been really great to sort of see the impact of that. And, going back to like, what's it all for? Like that is a nice reminder sometimes.
Yeah.
And then on the other side, I think it's funny. I'm always like, I'm just such a like comedic person. I get really sensitive and I will cry about it in the shower, but then I'll leave and I'll post on my Instagram like the worst comment and like laugh about it, because it is just like at the end of the day so funny to me that someone says the crazy stuff that they say. And I always refer to like anyone who listens to my show. I would feel weird if I was like, oh, they're my fan. Like that's weird. They listen to my podcast, and like if I know them in real life, they're my friend. And I love looking at like the 1-star reviews, and I'm like, those are my fans. Like those are the fans for sure.
Those are the diehards. They don't miss a fucking episode.
They don't miss an episode. So it is. I try to be light about it. I'm sure some days I'm like, I'm quitting because Susie hates my podcast and thinks that I'm bad at this and hates that I read so slow and blah, 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 blah. There was like one comment that was like, listen at 1.25 or 2 times or not at all. I was like,
okay, Jesus, okay. Yeah,
that escalated very quickly. But yeah, it's just, I don't know. It is what it is. Because I guess on the other side of it, because it's my story, I'm like, there is no critique you can make that I can change. Like I can't do anything about this because the story and the meat of this is not changeable. Like this is just the reality of my life.
You're telling a story that is your story. So
yeah, I'm like, I can't do anything about this. So
I'm
you don't
sorry,
really like it.
This is what happened in my life. So
yeah, I'm like, next script I write, I'll send it to you for notes.
Yeah,
but for
I'm
this,
not making it up every
can't.
week. Yeah.
Yeah.
So what are we looking forward to next? I mean, I know you have a big summer. You have, a lot of episodes you've been working on. You've only dove deeper into this case, and I feel like my gut instinct is that you're going to keep uncovering more and more, and no matter how much time it takes or the level of cooperation at the right particular time, I think that there's enough momentum there and a force to be reckoned with that it's gonna force a hand of something eventually. So in your eyes, how do you see, like, how do you want this to play out? How does the podcast chapter of you investigating your dad end, or does it?
God, I hope so.
Right. Same.
I think, in a perfect world, obviously, I think it ends with solving the case. Obviously, an ideal scenario is like through the court system.
An arrest and like a prosecution. Yeah. Yes.
But I'm okay with just knowing. So yeah, figuring it out in some sense and knowing definitively, like knowing because someone who was there said, or someone confesses or whatever, just knowing the truth, I think would be great. There's been a lot of people that have reached out with their own stories and sort of looking for help and answers, and a lot of questions about, what is next and what I want to do with this sort of Frankenstein that I've built. I want to make movies. So I'm going to make a movie soon. And that is going to be sort of my next hyperfixation. And I think that I need a break from whatever I've done.
Sure.
So if there's a world in which that sort of revives as like another person's story or helping someone else's, I'm not saying no to, but I have a slate of projects that I want to make that have nothing to do with this. I would say after this, or while this is happening, you could probably expect to see a Madison McGhee film pretty soon.
Mm-hmm.
I am talking to one of my all-time favorite creators about what will happen eventually when this podcast becomes a scripted something.
So that still is a goal, right? Like you would love to see the HBO treatment of this tale.
Yeah, for
right.
sure.
Yeah, that'd be very cool. Yeah.
I think there's a really unique opportunity to tell this story because of the location and the demographic of people that this story sort of talks about that deserve to be seen on television.
Yep. It's got it's got the setting, it's got the time period, it's got the race issue that is, people are more aware of now today than they were, I guess, yesterday and years prior. And it's also got you at the center spearheading a real life, investigation. And it's a fucking mystery, right? And people like mysteries because it drives them crazy to not know what happened. At least for me,
Totally. That's funny. I envision it, and I just spent all night writing this sort of pitch, but it's almost, I want it to feel just as much of like a coming of age story as it does a mystery, because I think it shouldn't feel like a crime show, but it is, but it shouldn't feel like that.
And that's something you probably do even better through like visually, right? Like that, 6-year-old you to 16-year-old you, and like kind of, I don't know how it would be structured, but flashbacks and like telling a story in a way that like can really express how that shaped you and the dynamics of what you're getting into in modern day, right? I think that's like in itself is like a really powerful character and like a protagonist.
Yeah.
But what do I know? I'm not a writer, but let me know when you want me to executive produce it, and I'll send you an invoice.
Perfect.
Well, it was great catching up with you, and we should definitely plan like some sort of Boston trip. I know Meredith will be coming at some point.
I feel like she just got back from somewhere.
I think she's in Italy.
Yeah.
For like a Taylor Swift thing. It sounded cool.
Oh, yes.
But yeah, that could be fun, and we could maybe do some content and just have fun and like, I don't know, shoot some shit, record some shit, just kind of see what happens.
We need to make a song. Okay, anyways.
All right, well, send me the beat.
But yeah, no, this was great. Thanks for having me.
All right, I'll see y'all soon.
Talking to Death is a production of TenderfootTV and iHeart Podcasts, created and hosted by Payne Lindsey. For TenderfootTV, executive producers are Payne Lindsey and Donald Albright. Co-executive producer is Mike Rooney. For iHeart Podcasts, executive producers are Matt Frederick and Alex Williams, with original music by Makeup and Vanity Set. Additional production by Mike Rooney, Dylan Harrington, Sean Nerney, Dayton Cole, and Gustav Wild for Cogito. Production support by Tracy Kaplan, Mara Davis, and Trevor Young. Mixing and mastering by Cooper Skinner and Dayton Cole. Our cover art was created by Rob Sheridan. Check out our website, talkingtodeathpodcast.com.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Talking to Death. This series is released weekly, absolutely free. But if you want ad-free listening and exclusive bonuses, you can subscribe to Tenderfoot Plus on Apple Podcasts or go to tenderfootplus.com.